nuclear energy. Humanity began using it, as usual, in a cruel way, by creating means to destroy each other. After all, the development of nuclear weapons was triggered by World War II. Scientists from both opposing sides, Germany and the anti-Hitler coalition, were working on it at the same time. The first research into harnessing atomic energy began even before the war, in Germany, England, and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. But later, it was carried out with maximum scale and focus. They continued in the United States, where leading European scientists who had emigrated to America from countries occupied by Germany were involved in the research. In 1939, Albert Einstein wrote a letter to the President of the United States, in which he explained the need to conduct large-scale experiments to study the possibility of creating an atomic bomb. Einstein based his proposal on the alarming successes of Nazi Germany in this field. But at the same time as the military developments, research was being conducted into the possibility of using atomic energy for peaceful purposes. In this documentary, we will look at both sides of this coin. Of course, even with this decent runtime, it's impossible to fully cover such a vast topic. However, you will definitely see the finest examples of military technology, including secret ones. You could say flagship models of nuclear clubs. And at the same time, this film will feature lesser-known developments that show the other side of the coin. Portable sources of atomic energy that could change the world. And maybe someday they actually will. So, let's go. In 1964, an experiment was conducted in the United States. They gathered 3 PhDs who had just received their degrees, and they were tasked with designing an atomic bomb using materials from public libraries. All of this was called a national experiment to understand how difficult it would be for a nuclear country to create an atomic bomb based on open information. After only 3 years, the experiment was halted. The physicists' near solutions proved the experiment's success. It turns out that any country with 3 really good physicists, not even geniuses, can design a functional nuclear device. But if it's so easy to build an atomic bomb, then why isn't the so-called nuclear club expanding? Let's figure it out. The nuclear club refers to the group of countries that have managed to develop, produce, and test weapons of mass destruction. According to the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons of 1968, the established nuclear powers are recognized as the United States, Russia, the United Kingdom, France, and China. Together with the United Nations, they work to prevent the emergence of new nuclear powers. But the path of the old member countries of the nuclear club was also very difficult and began more than 80 years ago. The Americans were the first to conduct nuclear tests in 1945, detonating the Trinity bomb with a yield of 20 kilotons in New Mexico. Trinity became the result and the crowning achievement of the famous Manhattan Project. A blindingly bright flash was followed by a wave of heat and a shock wave of colossal force. It left a mushroom-shaped cloud at the site of the explosion, which stretched 12 kilometers into the atmosphere. Thousands of meters of the surrounding desert sand turned into shiny, radioactive jade-green glass. The test was considered a success. The scientists who created the bomb were astonished. Physicist Isidore Rabi expressed concern that humanity had become a threat to all life on the planet and had disrupted the balance of nature. The test reminded Oppenheimer of a line from the Bhagavad Gita. "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." Test director Ken Bainbridge told Oppenheimer, "We are all sons of bitches now." Just a few weeks after that, on August 6 and 9, 1945, the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were bombed. Since then, and up to the present, the United States has remained the only country to have used nuclear weapons in warfare. In 1949, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics was the first to break America's monopoly on the atomic bomb by conducting a 22-kiloton test at the Semipalatinsk test site. Thus, nuclear parity was achieved. In 1952, the United Kingdom detonated its own bomb. And in 1960, France conducted a test in the Algerian oasis of Regain. Then it was the turn of the Asian powers. In 1964, China conducted a test near Lake Lop Nur, and 10 years later, India carried out an explosion in the state of Rajasthan. Interestingly, the Indians only acknowledged their nuclear status in 1998. At the same time, outraged by their neighbors' actions, Pakistan tested 6 devices in the underground tunnels of Balochistan province. Well, since 2006, North Korea's nuclear weapons have become a headache for the West. You could say that North Korea joined the nuclear club without knocking. And then, in March 2022, in North Korea, they are testing the Hwasong-17 intercontinental ballistic missile. Today, this 17th model claims the title of the largest intercontinental ballistic missile in the world. Its diameter is estimated at 2.4 meters, and its total mass, when fully fueled, can reach 110 tons. North Korea turned the launch of the monster missile into a blockbuster. Now let's look at the rhetoric of the powers. In North Korea, the missile tests are positioned as part of nuclear war deterrence forces. 2 hours after the Hwasong's flight, South Korea launched 5 of its own missiles, calling it a demonstration of the ability and readiness to respond immediately and punish. In the United States, the missile launch was called a blatant violation of numerous United Nations Security Council resolutions, and it was noted that North Korea risks destabilizing the security situation in the region. The United States will take all necessary measures to ensure the security of the American homeland, the Republic of Korea, and Japanese allies, the White House statement said. At the same time, new United Nations sanctions against the Democratic People's Republic of Korea are impossible due to the veto power of Russia and China. The Japanese Ministry of Defense released a video showing the missile's condensation trail and announced that the current launch was the most technically successful in the Democratic People's Republic of Korea's history. The head of the Ministry of Defense, Nobuo Kishi, was especially concerned. Calculations show that the range could be more than 15,000 kilometers, depending on the weight of the warhead. Therefore, the whole United States territory, including the East Coast, is within the radius. Now is the perfect time to return to the composition of the so-called United States Nuclear Club. Russia, Britain, France, and the People's Republic of China are among the old nuclear powers that signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. The younger powers, India, Pakistan, and the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, did not sign the document. After the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics collapsed, Soviet nuclear weapons were in Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan. However, these nations willingly relinquished their nuclear arsenals. Some countries provide their territory for the deployment of nuclear weapons within NATO. These are Germany, Italy, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Turkey, which do not have their own bombs. Israel stands apart. The country neither confirms nor denies rumors about having such an arsenal. According to experts, the Israelis have been developing nuclear warheads since the late 1960s. South Africa also had nuclear weapons, but all 6 warheads were destroyed after the end of the apartheid regime. There is a theory that Israel helped the South Africans develop their bombs. Iran has been accused of attempting to acquire its own nuclear weapons under the cover of independent nuclear energy. In 2015, Tehran and the Group of 6, consisting of the United States, Britain, France, Germany, Russia, and China, signed an agreement on the Iranian nuclear program. The Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action implied a gradual lifting of sanctions in exchange for halting potentially dangerous developments. This process is not without obstacles. At the beginning of 2022, the Federation of American Scientists counted approximately 12,700 nuclear warheads in the possession of 9 countries. About 90% of the weapons belong to the United States and Russia. Here's a breakdown by numbers of how the warheads are distributed among the nuclear club. Russia, 5,977. United States, 5,428. China, 350. France, 290. United Kingdom, 225. Pakistan, 165. India, 160. Israel, 90. North Korea, 20. However, it should be remembered that no country discloses the exact number of warheads in service. In addition, about a quarter of the world's nuclear weapons have been retired from service but have not been dismantled. Even more importantly, many of the treaties that ensure nuclear parity will expire in 2026. There isn't even a draft for a new treaty, and it's quite likely that a new full-scale arms race will begin. However, some experts believe that it has already begun. Last year, the head of the United States Armed Forces Strategic Command, Charles Richard, expressed concern that China is making a strategic breakthrough. Now the admiral warns that America risks losing the battle for military dominance. President Joe Biden expressed a similar sentiment when he predicted that the United States is entering a decisive decade. In national security reports prepared by his administration in recent months, Russia is labeled as an acute threat, while China is described as a worsening problem. In China, the nuclear arsenal is rapidly expanding. If at the beginning of the 2020s the country had 200 to 300 warheads, by 2035 their number is expected to reach approximately 1,500. Thus, China, at least in its nuclear weapons development strategy, plans to approach the level of the United States and Russia. According to the new Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, which is the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, they can have up to 1,550 deployed warheads. Like many nuclear powers, China has long adhered to minimalism in its deterrence policy. Several hundred warheads were considered a sufficient arsenal to respond to a surprise attack if necessary. During the Cold War, the United States and the United States Soviet republics remained the only states whose strategy was based on the constant buildup of power in an attempt to surpass their opponent. However, since the mid-1980s, when the nuclear arsenal of each country consisted of about 60,000 missiles, their number has been significantly reduced thanks to mutual limitation agreements. According to the new Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty Agreement, signed by Barack Obama and Dmitry Medvedev, the United States and Russia can have no more than 700 intercontinental ballistic missiles, submarine-launched ballistic missiles, and heavy bombers. In January of last year, both sides extended the agreement until February 2026. Opponents of nuclear weapons in the United States advocate for further measures of containment and disarmament. Some suggest following China's example and declaring a no-first-use policy, under which the authorities can authorize a nuclear strike only in response to a similar attack from another country. Until recently, Biden promoted a similar but more vague formulation, according to which deterring nuclear attacks was declared the sole purpose of American nuclear weapons. However, the events in Ukraine and the Allies' dissatisfaction with a possible weakening of United States military capabilities forced them to abandon such rhetoric. The second reason why the American leadership suspended nuclear disarmament was the actions of another country focused on increasing its arsenal. In recent years, 300 intercontinental ballistic missile bunkers have appeared in China, and Project 94 Jin submarines have been equipped with GL, 3 intercontinental ballistic missiles, which can easily reach the United States. In addition, the Chinese Army has bombers at its disposal, H-6, which serve as carriers of nuclear and hypersonic weapons. The latest actions of the People's Republic of China authorities suggest that they are ready to use the corresponding weapons at any moment, just like their strategic opponents. China's policy has become more secretive and its rhetoric more aggressive. The global goal is to accelerate the end of the world order in which the dominant role belongs to the West, to force America to coexist peacefully with China and to treat it with respect. Chinese representatives state that they will only agree to negotiate on arsenal reduction if the 2 other countries with the largest nuclear capabilities follow their example. What does it take to make a nuclear bomb? There are 2 simplest designs for atomic weapons: the implosion type and the gun type, as well as their hybrids. The gun type is considered a bit simpler. In it, 1 piece of uranium-235 is literally shot into a target of the same composition using a gunpowder charge. The point is that this element in the piece must be at least 80%, and ideally more than 90%. Both pieces have a subcritical mass, so by themselves they cannot start a chain reaction with a nuclear explosion. However, their almost instantaneous coming together allows for quickly reaching the critical mass needed to start a chain reaction with the parameters necessary for a nuclear explosion. The speed at which the 2 pieces come together, like in a cannon shot, is critically important here, because if it is too slow, the chain reaction will have time to heat up the pieces and start the process of their evaporation. In this case, the power of the explosion will be greatly reduced. The cannon-type design is simple to set up. If you have uranium-235 of the required enrichment, any artillery factory can make the cannon itself. This type of bomb was dropped on Hiroshima on August 6, 1945. The simplicity of making the munition also has its downside. The critical mass needed for a nuclear explosion is higher, about 15 kilograms. In the Hiroshima bomb, the components weren't perfected, so it contained even more uranium. A higher mass of the munition doesn't just make it less compact. A greater issue is that enriched uranium-235, the fissile material, is extremely hard to acquire. In natural uranium, only 0.7% is the 235 isotope, and the rest is the heavier uranium-238, which does not sustain a chain reaction. To raise the concentration of the 235 isotope to 80 to 90%. During the Manhattan Project, the United States took the extremely energy-intensive diffusion route. In this process, uranium is first fluorinated to uranium hexafluoride, then heated to 56.4 degrees Celsius, which causes the hexafluoride to boil. In its gas form, it passes through multiple membranes. The heavier uranium-238 is gradually separated, and as a result, enrichment of the uranium-235 isotope is achieved. This whole process is extremely energy inefficient. The American diffusion plant consumed 3 gigawatts of power, which is about as much as 3 large nuclear reactors or a whole dozen decent thermal power plants produce. As a result, the plant lost economic competition to Russian producers who used centrifuges. When spinning, they create an artificial equivalent of increased gravity, causing the heavier molecules with uranium-238 to settle down, while those with the lighter uranium-235 remain higher up. Uranium enrichment using the diffusion method is so expensive that it isn't used simply for financial reasons, while the use of gas centrifuge technology requires the highest technological level from the operator. Let me explain with an example. When the Iron Curtain fell in the 90s, Russian fuel producers, now the company TVEL, were able to start supplying the international market, and it turned out that their fuel was objectively cheaper. Then, in the United States, they wanted to build their own gas centrifuges to compete with Russia on equal terms. This started in 1995. 16 years later, by 2011, it came to the first test launch of a centrifuge cascade. As a result, some of them were destroyed quite spectacularly. After all, modern centrifuges for these purposes have a rotation speed of 1,500 revolutions per second. This is the cutting edge of human technology. It's very difficult to achieve in a short time. It takes decades of gradual improvement. It ended so sadly that the American government did not renew the license of the corporation that was in charge of all this. Consequently, the costly gas diffusion program was terminated, and the centrifuge efforts encountered setbacks. The United States has long had no domestic producers of nuclear fuel, let alone its own production of weapons-grade uranium. So it turns out that only a handful of people can really possess these technologies. Iran, China, and several other countries have their own centrifuges, but China buys them from Russia. Some players initially imported the technology, while other countries spent decades and huge financial resources on these technologies. However, as we have already noted, there is another scheme, not a gun type, but an implosive one. It uses not uranium-235, but plutonium-239. The fundamental difference here is that plutonium can be obtained without these two inconvenient conditions. Either the first, which are too expensive in terms of energy and finances, diffusion methods, or the second, extremely complex centrifuge facilities. In addition, its critical mass is about 6 kilograms, which allows for the creation of significantly more compact nuclear warheads. Here is a ring made of plutonium, 239.11 centimeters in diameter and weighing 5.3 kilograms, produced in America. This amount of plutonium is enough to make an atomic bomb with an efficient beryllium reflector. This type of fissile material is produced in a nuclear reactor, where uranium-238 captures one of the neutrons and becomes plutonium-239. However, it's not that simple here either. If uranium-238 is exposed to the neutron flux from the reactor for a long time, there will be too much of it. plutonium-240. It forms when uranium-238, having just absorbed a neutron, becomes plutonium-239 and then immediately captures a second neutron, turning into plutonium-240. The latter produces too strong a neutron background, and if it makes up more than 7% of the plutonium used for nuclear weapons, the risk of the entire project failing increases sharply. After all, the implosion design involves an explosion that compresses the plutonium element of the device. With too high a neutron background, even at the beginning of the explosion that creates the conditions for a nuclear detonation, the fissile material will heat up and evaporate prematurely before it can fully react. This will destroy the atomic device itself, but it won't produce the intended explosive yield. You'll end up with a very expensive but relatively harmless firecracker. So, weapons-grade plutonium must contain little plutonium-240, specifically less than 8%. This can be achieved by exposing uranium-238 to the reactor for only a very short time. Technologically, these must be reactors that allow you to quickly insert and remove rods with uranium-238 right during operation. This is technically impossible in regular reactors. In theory, there's nothing impossible about creating a nuclear reactor of a different type, such a highly specialized weapon-grade one. In 1942, the Americans built the world's first reactor entirely from natural uranium without any enrichment. To slow down neutrons to speeds at which uranium can capture them most effectively, they used a neutron moderator, graphite, which they cut on regular woodworking machines. For strength, the graphite structure was reinforced with a wooden frame. Nevertheless, someone had to design a reactor in which a rod with uranium-238 could be quickly inserted and removed. An extremely small number of people know how to design nuclear reactors so that they actually work. And again, only a few countries have such scientific and organizational personnel, and doing this secretly from other states is practically impossible. However, a curious viewer might argue that a dirty bomb can be made without advanced technology. Theoretically, that's not a problem. You could take a mixture of certain chemical elements, which we can't name since we're not allowed to provide practical instructions. Fill the tubes, which are usually loaded with nuclear fuel, with this mixture and put them into regular, standard reactors for about a year. Then take them out and use the material to fill any simple rocket, or even an artillery shell. But you can't get any weapon of mass destruction this way. The number of victims from radiation contamination won't be much higher than from the explosions of such munitions themselves. Producing the necessary amounts of dangerous isotopes takes a long time. They're hard to store, and it's impossible to do all this secretly. You can still make a couple of rods and quietly put them into shells, but no country in the world can secretly fill thousands of rods with the necessary elements, set up mass production, and create hundreds or thousands of dirty bomb-type munitions. And what if you try to fill a dirty bomb not with a special mixture of elements, but with spent nuclear fuel? You can try, but there will be two problems. First, spent nuclear fuel is most dangerous when it's noticeably hot. Not all of the most dangerous isotopes in it have burned out yet, but hot spent fuel is very inconvenient to put into any kind of munition. And again, there's very little use for such dirty bombs. The main part of it consists of long-lived isotopes, whose radiation is rather moderate, and even the presence of shorter-lived elements doesn't help. Such spent fuel is dozens or even hundreds of times safer than the optimal mixture of chemical elements that has been in a reactor for a year. So theoretically, any country will retain this dirty bomb capability as long as it has at least one nuclear reactor in operation. But in practice, dirty bombs are ineffective in a military sense and absolutely suicidal in terms of public relations. Now, let's take a look at the so-called nuclear triad, the set of nuclear clubs possessed by the most powerful members of the nuclear club. The term is nuclear triad. The military uses this term to refer to three different types of weapons capable of delivering nuclear warheads: strategic aviation, intercontinental ballistic missiles, and submarine-launched missile carriers. Which countries have managed to assemble a complete set of all three components of the triad? Only Russia and the United States have a full deadly collection, which sets them apart from all other countries and makes the global nuclear standoff mainly an arms race between these two nations. The main principle that the military follows when deploying nuclear weapons is to distribute warheads among the main types of armed forces. This ensures that if opponents strike the existing arsenals, there won't be a complete destruction of them. Therefore, even if one or two basic components of the Triad are disabled, there will still be the capability to deliver a devastating retaliatory strike. Historically, heavy bombers were the first carriers of nuclear free-fall bombs. As time went on and technology improved, missiles replaced bombs. Modern missile-carrying bombers have serious drawbacks. They require ground infrastructure and are based at locations that are vulnerable to enemy strikes. That's why using aircraft carrying nuclear weapons outside of the Triad makes no sense at all. Many countries that can't afford to develop all delivery methods at once don't even start developing strategic bombers. What's the point of spending enormous resources on something that will be destroyed in the first minutes of a war? A little later, we'll talk about how much the United States spends on developing its secret bombers. For the United States and Russia, strategic aviation is simply essential. In the 60s, during moments of maximum military tension, both sides even organized airborne alert duty. This helped reduce the risk of aircraft being destroyed and saved valuable time that would otherwise be spent on preparation and takeoff. Now the aircraft are on standby on the ground, maintaining a 5-minute combat readiness status. Strategic aviation, despite all its vulnerabilities, has a huge advantage that people often seem to forget. An aircraft taking off can be brought back to the ground if the alarm turns out to be false, but an intercontinental ballistic missile has no plans to return. If an intercontinental ballistic missile launched due to a false alarm reaches its target, catastrophe is inevitable. Automatic systems will be triggered. A retaliatory strike will follow. The most destructive war in human history will begin, and most likely, civilization will be set back by several centuries. If it survives, of course. The main advantage of strategic bombers is their ability to make long-range flights and strike almost anywhere on the planet. Thanks to their ability to stay in the air for a long time, they can patrol the enemy's border, exerting political pressure without crossing the line allowed by international law. Strategic missile-carrying bombers are complex machines that require a high level of training not only for pilots, but also for a huge team on the ground. Regular training keeps professionals in good shape. The Russian Ministry of Defense reports on some elements of training in its information bulletins. For example, in April of this year, Tu-160 and Tu-95 MS bombers launched cruise missiles at targets on the training ground during exercises. These aircraft are designed to carry out strike missions against the most important targets in remote areas and deep behind enemy lines. The crews practiced aerial refueling at an altitude of over 6,000 meters and a speed of about 600 kilometers per hour. The Tu-1600 has been in service since 2005, and it saw its first combat action in 2015. The aircraft can ascend into the stratosphere. Thanks to this, the plane easily escapes enemy fighters and becomes unreachable for most air defense systems. A modified model is planned for release, which will be designated with the letter M. New onboard computing systems, an electronic warfare suite, and a weapons control system have already been created for them. The serial production of the newest aircraft is planned to begin in 2023. The military department will acquire at least 50 of these missile carriers. Experts call the Tu-160 an absolute record holder in terms of armament. After all, one White Swan can lift 45 tons of bombs and missiles into the air, and its maximum takeoff weight is as much as 275 tons, which is significantly more than its competitors. Tu-95 MS. In the West, it's called the Bear. It doesn't have high-speed characteristics since it's a turboprop missile carrier. The first flight of this monster took place back in the distant 50s, and its peer, the creation of American engineers, the strategic bomber B-52. The supersonic bombers Tu-22 and M-3 are called the universal soldiers of Russia's long-range aviation. They are designed to carry out combat missions on land and naval theaters of operations. They can strike both moving and stationary, single and group targets with missiles and bombs. day and night in both simple and complex weather conditions. British military experts call the Tu-22M3 the deadliest Russian aircraft in history. The further development of strategic bombers comes down to increasing flight range and creating new missiles. Speed takes a back seat, since it can no longer guarantee the survivability of the aircraft. The strategists of the future will have to deal with advanced surface-to-air missile systems and next-generation air-to-air missiles. That's why, when developing aircraft, the focus is on reducing radar visibility. How does America respond in terms of strategic bombers? The heavy strategic bomber B-2 was adopted by the United States Air Force in the 90s. Aircraft of this series are called the world's first stealth strategic bombers. The original wing design and coating made of radar-absorbing materials make the aircraft almost invisible. Each of these birds is capable of flying more than 11,000 kilometers without refueling and can carry up to 27 tons, armaments including missiles with nuclear warheads. The Americans used the B-2 during the bombings of Yugoslavia, as well as in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Libya. Each plane is worth its weight in gold. In 1998, the cost of one such bomber was estimated at $1 billion, and taking development costs into account, $2 billion. This makes this plane the most expensive in the history of world aviation. By the way, the history of stealth technology deserves special attention. In 1966, an American radar specialist working at the Lockheed plant came across an article by the Soviet physicist Petr Ufimtsev in a popular Soviet science and technology magazine. The article stated that aircraft of a certain type, made from specific materials, shaped and painted in a certain way, are practically invisible to radar. The article greatly interested American military specialists, and in the United States, they decided to build and test such an aircraft. As a result, in the early 1990s, the United States produced the F-117 fighter bomber and the very same heavy strategic bomber, B-2. Pyotr Ufimtsev himself took part in the latter's creation. After all, in the 1980s, work on the Soviet stealth project based on Ufimtsev's ideas was stopped in Russia, and the designer emigrated to the United States. However, there is a theory that this technology was actually deliberately given to the Americans, since it had been tested in the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, and they decided to abandon it. After all, at least 2 Soviet design bureaus built and tested different types of stealth aircraft. Authoritative commissions came to conclusions that were not in favor of stealth technologies. One way or another, the top priority for American stealth bombers was chosen to be minimal radar visibility for air defense systems, and they started building a machine capable of breaking through air defense zones at high altitude and at supersonic speed. But during the design process, it turned out that the Russian modification of the S-300 surface-to-air missile system would detect the B-2 at high altitude and shoot it down. Then the concept changed. It became necessary to break through to enemy targets at minimum altitude and, if possible, to follow the contours of the terrain. For a 170-ton giant, that's extremely difficult. They lowered the flight altitude, but only to about 70 meters, and the maximum speed became close to supersonic. In general, the designers were literally cornered, trying to achieve the lowest possible visibility for the aircraft. They achieved it at the expense of literally all other characteristics. Right now, the United States is developing the new B-21 bomber, which will replace the existing strategic models. The goal of American engineers is to reduce the size of the aircraft and replace the electronics with more modern ones. According to photographs obtained by researchers, infrastructure is actively being prepared at air bases for testing the new aircraft. The Americans also have this old-timer, the B-52 or the Stratofortress Stratege, which has been in service with the United States Air Force since as far back as 1955. With planned upgrades, which are expected to cost $12 billion, it still remains the main long-range bomber aircraft of the United States Air Force. Alongside the B-1B Lancer, in turn, the supersonic strategic bomber with variable sweep wings, the B-1 Lancer was created specifically as a nuclear weapons carrier to replace the B-52. However, in the early 1990s, the B-1 aircraft began to be refitted to equip them with conventional weapons. China is not standing aside and is working on the promising strategic bomber H-20. It is believed that in some technical characteristics, it may surpass the latest developments of both Russian and American designers. However, the Celestial Empire's authorities keep all information strictly secret, which is unsurprising. Let's move on to the next component of the nuclear triad. The real monsters, intercontinental ballistic missiles. They are designed to destroy targets at medium and long range using a nuclear warhead. Modern models are equipped with protection against missile defense systems by using decoy targets and a multiple independently targetable re-entry vehicle. If you can try to deal with a single missile like this, no missile defense system can handle a barrage of such missiles. ICBMs are launched from stationary installations, mobile complexes, and nuclear submarines. The first serious developments in missile weaponry were made by Hitler's Germany. The V-1 and V-2 were developed secretly in the 1930s and 1940s. After being defeated in World War II, Germany lost its prototypes, which ended up in the United States and the United States Soviet republics almost simultaneously. For engineers in both countries, this was the discovery of the century. The Americans managed to create their Redstone literally a year later. And by 1948, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics had developed the R-1 rocket. An intercontinental ballistic missile consists of booster stages and a warhead section. The warhead, the enemy missile defense suppression system, and onboard electronics are located there. The missile's boost phase lasts up to 5 minutes, and the speed reached by the warhead is truly enormous, 6 to 8 kilometers per second. To confuse the missile defense system, transmitters, jammers, decoys, and various types of reflectors are used. The weight of the missile defense penetration system alone can reach 500 kilograms. Low flight altitude also greatly reduces an intercontinental ballistic missile's visibility. The most protected missiles are considered to be those placed in silo-type launchers. These systems are so fortified and buried so deep that they can withstand a direct hit from an enemy intercontinental ballistic missile, which guarantees a retaliatory strike. Naturally, in both the United States and Russia, the silos are dispersed across the territory and kept secret. The warhead of an intercontinental ballistic missile spends most of its flight as a space object, rising to an altitude 3 times higher than the International Space Station. Of course, this entire enormous trajectory has to be calculated with maximum precision. Mobile launchers are distinguished by their rapid repositioning. They are extremely difficult to disable due to their detection complexity and protection. Of course, no one will name the exact number of such vehicles. Such missile systems are possessed by different countries, but it's also interesting to take a look at this unique combat railway missile complex. It's also known as the Ghost Train or Train Number 0. Similar trains were also developed in the United States. The official reasons for decommissioning such monsters were their outdated design, the high cost of restoring the production of the complex in Russia, and a preference for mobile launchers based on trucks. In April 2022, the first launch of the Sarmat complex took place. So that Washington would not perceive the launch as a threat, Moscow even warned the United States about the tests in advance. This is a missile system with a heavy intercontinental liquid-fueled ballistic missile that weighs more than 200 tons. The Ministry of Defense confirmed the calculated characteristics throughout the flight. The training warheads arrived at the Kura test range in Kamchatka. After testing, the missile system will be adopted by the Strategic Missile Forces. According to the Ministry of Defense, Sarmat is the most powerful missile with the longest range in the world for striking targets. It has unique characteristics that allow it to reliably overcome any existing missile defense systems. In 2016, the United States began developing its newest ballistic missile, Straj. The company that won the competition to develop it received a contract worth more than $13 billion. The first test flight is scheduled for 2023, and the first units will be ready by 2029. In total, the United States plans to deploy 400 of these missiles. They will feature new guidance systems and electronic countermeasures, which should increase the missile's survivability in flight, its ability to overcome missile defense systems, and its accuracy. By the way, it was during the discussion of this development that journalists got hold of information about how much the United States spends on each component of the nuclear triad. Intercontinental ballistic missiles consume $2 billion of taxpayers' money per year. The operation and maintenance of strategic bombers cost $3 billion, and submarines about $4 billion. Well, now for the promised bonus. The Skiff missile system is a nuclear weapon in the Russian Navy and is strictly classified. The system is capable of staying on the ocean floor for many years before on command, striking a designated target with a missile that flies at hypersonic speed and follows the terrain. The idea of creating ballistic missiles with permanent deployment on the ocean floor emerged back in the mid-60s. However, according to researchers, no development was carried out at that time. In the United States, the idea was abandoned, as the project was deemed too costly and complex. But seabed deployment has an advantage compared to the use of submarines. A nuclear submarine can be tracked acoustically and destroyed, but the location where the missile is installed, which is delivered to the deployment site by a special submarine, cannot be tracked by existing intelligence means. The thickness of the water weakens the impact, and in a strong container, Skiff will survive even an explosion directly above it. In 2017, the head of the Defense and Security Committee of the Federation Council, Viktor Bondarev, stated that the seabed intercontinental ballistic missile is already in the arsenal of the Russian armed forces. However, the military has not disclosed the principle of operation or technical details to this day. And since we've touched on the naval topic, let's take a look at the most dangerous element of the nuclear triad: nuclear submarines. When it's on a mission, it can't be seen and is almost impossible to track. It can dive to a depth of 300 meters and stay there for half a year before launching missiles that will travel thousands of kilometers and destroy targets the size of entire countries. A nuclear submarine, a true weapon of the apocalypse, possessed only by the most powerful countries. Others simply can't afford it, either financially or technologically. The crazy race between developers from the Soviet Union and the United States of America resulted in the most intense military competition in history. Never before had humanity poured so much money into developing means of killing the enemy. Nobel laureates, the smartest people of their time, politicians, and societies. Everything was focused on creating the weapon of the future. It's hard to call the reputation of submarines perfect. Their ability to secretly travel thousands of kilometers has long attracted criminals. Colombian drug lords adapted their private submarines to transport illegal substances between countries. And right now, dozens of such submarines are plowing the ocean depths, transporting illegal cargo that can't be delivered any other way. Other countries' submarine technologies are literally being hunted for. In the 1970s, the CIA constructed a unique drilling ship that cost an astounding $350 million, an extraordinary sum for that era. The ship was ostensibly collecting minerals from the seabed for research, but was actually recovering a sunken Soviet submarine in the vicinity. Nuclear submarines sink quite often. In total, since 1955, 9 nuclear submarines have sunk: 5 Soviet, 2 Russian, and 2 American. By this questionable metric, the score is 7-2 in Russia's favor. Several nuclear-armed submarines remain submerged on the ocean floor, irretrievable. To be more precise, you could try, but there's a risk of destroying a couple of continents. The infamous Kursk, Project 949A Ante, became the most well-known disaster of the Russian Navy, and almost the only accident that happened due to weapon malfunctions. Most often, the cause of submarine sinkings is problems with the propulsion system. People in the know say that there are letters of last resort on board British submarines. They state what needs to be done in the event that the country's government is destroyed by an enemy nuclear attack. Such letters are destroyed immediately after a new prime minister takes office and gives new instructions. Silent nuclear predators are shrouded in a veil of myths, which is not surprising, since the level of secrecy in their production and operation is colossal. Journalists are kept at arm's length from such facilities, but sometimes, on special occasions, the veil of secrecy is lifted. In honor of the centenary of designer Sergei Kovalev's birth, Russian journalists were allowed onto TK-20 for the first time. Severstal is one of the nuclear strategic cruisers of Project 941 Akula, which was created under the guidance of the brilliant designer. The media learned little, but the information is more than enough to understand the destructive power of submarines of this class. The creation of the heavy missile-carrying strategic submarine cruiser was handled by the top-secret Rubin Central Design Bureau, starting in the 70s. Even back then, the KGB was monitoring the developers and even their family members, regularly tracking down agents of Western intelligence services who tried by any means to contact the nuclear engineers and extract details that were considered state secrets. The engineers' knowledge was more valuable than money, and foreigners were never able to buy this information. At that time, Soviet engineers created a real doomsday weapon, a three-stage solid-fuel ballistic missile, the R-39. A single missile like this is capable of delivering 10 warheads, each with a yield of 100 kilotons, to a distance of up to 10,000 kilometers. Moreover, the Akula has 20 missile silos, each containing 10 nuclear warheads. The combined destructive power of 200 warheads is 1,400 times greater than the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. How can you defend against such a hurricane of missiles, each one a real Armageddon? It's a mystery. It's no wonder that submarines of this project literally terrified the NATO leadership. These missiles were very bulky, and the Akula was created specifically for them. A large submarine was needed, capable of carrying super-heavy weapons and firing salvos. 173 meters long and as tall as a 9-story building. This isn't a boat, it's a small city. The main advantage of the submarine is its ability to travel underwater at 50 kilometers per hour while remaining almost completely silent. Only 6 of these submarines were ever built, and now only 3 remain. They made it into the Guinness Book of Records as the largest nuclear submarines on Earth. The anti-sonar rubber coating alone on them weighs 800 tons. That's more than the entire weight of an American nuclear submarine, the NR-1. With its hull, it can break through ice up to 2.5 meters thick. The Akula-class submarines are so huge that they had to build a special docking line for them, develop a missile loading system, and even construct a special missile transport vehicle. These ships didn't serve for long. Their operation was astronomically expensive. Right now, Severstal is in reserve and awaiting a decision on disposal. The general director of the top-secret shipyard stated that Project 941 submarines are obsolete due to technological advancements. Currently, the crew on Severstal has been reduced, but the ship's life is being maintained. There is a round-the-clock armed watch. Fire safety and unsinkability are being monitored, and of course, the nuclear reactors have been brought to a safe state. The Beret-class submarines have replaced the Akulas. Their story began back in 1996, when the first submarine of the new type was laid down in Severodvinsk. Fleet funding in the 90s was unstable, and this affected the construction timeline of the submarine. The first of the new class of nuclear submarines was Yuri Dolgoruki, which joined the Northern Fleet in 2013. The Russian Navy currently possesses 5 Project 955 Bore-class submarines. Soon, Alexander Nevsky and Vladimir Monomakh joined Yuri Dolgoruki, and they are serving in the Pacific Ocean. Knyaz Vladimir and Knyaz Oleg, who expanded the list of modern Russian nuclear submarines named after former rulers of Russia, joined their brothers quite recently. In many respects, the Bore-class submarines surpass their competitor, the American Ohio-class, which is the backbone of the United States Strategic Submarine Fleet. The Ohio-class has a diving depth of 365 meters, which is 35 meters less than the Russian underwater monster. The creation of our domestic engineers also has an advantage in both speed and the duration of autonomous navigation. As an element of the nuclear triad, the Bore-class submarines are designed to destroy nuclear-powered vessels. They are armed with 16 of the latest solid-fuel Bulava ballistic missiles. Each of them carries 10 nuclear warheads with a yield of up to 150 kilotons. With a single salvo, the missile cruiser can destroy any city on Earth, regardless of its size. There would be no problem with a small country either. The creators do not disclose the technical features of the Bores, for obvious reasons, cautiously saying that the new type of ships has a number of advantages. Well, let's take their word for it and hope that sailors will never have to actually test the capabilities of these super submarines. That would be safer for all of humanity. There are also multi-purpose submarines. They perform other tasks, destroying ships, other submarines, tactical targets on land, and gathering intelligence. The most advanced of these submarines is the American Seawolf, whose main features are its extremely high level of stealth and deadly onboard weaponry. One such submarine can carry up to 50 Harpoon or Tomahawk missiles. It is so expensive that even the bottomless United States defense budget could only afford 3 of these submarines. Modern nuclear submarines can silently roam underwater for months, invisible to their enemies. They are built to remain silent, providing strategic security for the nation. At any moment, day or night, they are ready to plunge the enemy into the chaos that follows a devastating nuclear strike. By the way, if you go by movies, especially American ones, you might think that submarine wars happen regularly. Of course, that's not true. In history, there is only one confirmed case where 2 submarines fought underwater. Most of the missions that nuclear submarines take on involve staying hidden for long periods near enemy shores. Of course, the mission should start from a secret location, otherwise the submarine could be tracked. That's why submarine repairs are carried out at unique closed bases the size of a metropolis. The most important facilities at these bases are located deep underground in special bunkers. Initially, submarines were diesel-powered, but at the dawn of atomic research, scientists quickly realized that the enormous amount of energy released by splitting the atom could be used to generate electricity. The reactor enables high-speed travel for long durations. Refueling of the latest generation submarines is required only once every 25 years, which eliminates the need for regular surfacing to replenish fuel supplies. These vessels have only one drawback: the extremely high cost. So, if you want to buy one of these things to take a swim in the city pond, be prepared to spend several $billion. But experts say that with rising oil prices, nuclear submarines could become more economical than ships with traditional engines. Americans and the British have completely stopped using non-nuclear submarines. The Russian submarine fleet has a mixed composition. In fact, only 5 countries have nuclear submarines. Besides the United States and Russia, the elite club also includes France, England, and China. The rest use diesel-electric submarines, or don't have a submarine fleet at all. The evolution of nuclear-powered underwater predators was gradual. The first-generation designs were experimental, and the submarines themselves were used to test out engineering solutions in combat conditions. The next-generation submarines differed only slightly. Finding inspiration in how nature solved the problem of moving underwater, engineers copied fish fins, installing their metal counterparts on the submarine. The best minds of that time worked hard to optimize the hull and increase underwater speed. One of the submarines of this generation, Project 661 Anchar, by the way, set a speed record that has not been broken to this day. It could move at a fantastic speed for underwater vehicles of that size, over 80 kilometers per hour. Third-generation submarines already had completely different characteristics. We have to give credit to the Americans. At this stage, they were the ones making history. Ohio-class and Los Angeles-class submarines received reactors capable of operating for up to 11 years without refueling. Thanks to some interesting engineering solutions, the quality of life for the crew on board also improved. Building such vessels is expensive even for superpowers, which is why many third-generation submarines are still in service today. Well, now, welcome to the present. The fourth generation is the most modern. These submarines began to appear in the early 90s, which, by historical standards, was just yesterday. The nuclear submarines received a new type of sound-absorbing coating, composite materials, and long-life reactors. Since third-generation submarines suffered several disasters, a distinctive feature of fourth-generation submarines became their own autonomous rescue capsules and a fully isolated reactor. Modern nuclear submarines are characterized by an unprecedentedly low noise level. American engineers managed to fit 50 cruise missiles into their submarines. Modern deep-sea predators are equipped with universal launchers with drum magazines for launching torpedoes and cruise missiles. The fifth generation exists only on paper for now. The country that is the first to develop these monsters will obviously begin to dominate underwater. An American publication has released a list of the 5 most dangerous combat submarines in the world. The list included only active submarines, and those that will enter service in the near future. Only nuclear submarines from Russia and the United States made it into the top 5, and Russian submarines took up most of the list. The Borei-class submarines have been recognized by experts as some of the most intimidating. The American authors of the ranking also did not forget about the achievements of their own submarine fleet. They named the Ohio-class submarines as the most lethal nuclear submarines in the United States. Experts agree on one thing. If even a single missile is launched from a nuclear submarine, humanity will, at best, be thrown back centuries as a result of a nuclear catastrophe. At worst, it will simply cease to exist as a species. And everything will be pretty much like what you see in these shots. But maybe this is actually a test of intelligence. Or is it that, even now, it's not even worth mentioning humanity's intelligence at all? To answer this question, let's look at the other side of the coin, at those atomic technologies that humanity created not to destroy itself, but for other purposes. At the same time, we won't be looking at the usual peaceful atom, the standard nuclear power plant industry. As always, we'll take a slightly different angle and look at those peaceful atomic technologies that aren't as widely known as regular nuclear power plants. Who knows? Maybe they could have changed the world. After all, probably every inhabitant of planet Earth has had that thought. But what if this device isn't from the distant future, but from the fairly recent Soviet past? Let's take a look at this invention from the Soviet Union era. An isotope mini power plant that, in addition to everything else, provides almost free heating while operating. Here's the background of the issue. In 1821, physicist Thomas Johann Seebeck discovered an interesting effect. If a conductor made of 2 different metals is heated on one side and cooled on the other, electricity is generated. This phenomenon was called thermoelectricity, or the Seebeck effect. The efficiency of such an electric generator is very low, so it was forgotten for a long time. Soviet physicists remembered this effect during the Great Patriotic War. A simple and reliable electric generator was needed to charge the batteries of the partisan units' radios. They urgently set up the production of these kinds of pots, which generated thermoelectricity from the heat of an ordinary campfire. After the war, thermoelectric generators were used to power home radios. A kerosene lamp, the most common source of light in homes at that time, served as the heat source. Even the company Grundig equipped its radios with thermoelectric generators for a long time. With the beginning of the space age, thermoelectric generators were needed again. While solar panels can be used in near-Earth space, they are useless in deep space. Nuclear isotopes began to be used as a heat source for thermoelectric generators. Such generators are called RTGs, radioisotope thermoelectric generators. The advantage of an isotope is that it can provide consistently high thermal power for many years, with a decrease in output of less than 1% per year. Spacecraft use the isotope plutonium-238, which has a half-life of 88 years. It is considered the safest of all isotopes. Look at this photo. This girl is checking the operation of the thermoelectric generator without any protective suits. The only downside is the extremely high cost of plutonium-238. Such RTGs have been working for 44 years on American satellites that have left the solar system, providing electricity and heat to scientific equipment. For ground-based RTGs, another isotope was used, strontium-90. It's very cheap, but it requires a more massive protective shell. Also, it has a shorter service life. The half-life is 29 years. Thermogenerators were widely used in the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics to power lighthouses and remote radio navigation systems. In the early 70s, a decision was made to create a high-power, maintenance-free nuclear thermogenerator to provide electricity, heating, and hot water supply to remote settlements. In 1981, the project for the station with the romantic name Yelena was ready. The atomic thermoelectric station was completely maintenance-free. The assembled structure was a cylinder buried in the ground. There were no mechanisms, pumps, or engines in the design, so it could operate maintenance-free for up to 30 years. It generated up to 100 kilowatts of electrical power and up to 3,000 kilowatts of thermal energy. This was more than enough to heat an entire village. To confirm the accuracy of the calculations, an experimental station called Gamma was built at the Kurchatov Institute. The station operated for the required 30 years without a single incident. Moreover, scientists artificially created critical operating conditions up to a complete short circuit at the input, and Gamma withstood all the tests. Even after the collapse of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, enthusiasts proposed the widespread implementation of such stations, proving their high economic efficiency. But by that time, this red-haired character was already at the helm of Russia's energy system. Unified Energy System of Russia, Unified Energy System, and he clearly didn't need any of these innovations. The project was scrapped, arguing it was impossible to protect from vandals and terrorists. They cited the radioisotope thermoelectric generators in Kamchatka, destroyed by scrap metal hunters, as an example. The vivid vandalism photos were striking but unsurprising, as the radioisotope generators were left unguarded in the open after the organizations responsible for them were shut down by new authorities. Similar breakthrough developments from the late Union of Soviet Socialist Republics were being shut down in droves at that time. Burin suffered the same fate, a single thrilling flight followed by a project termination order. Or take the so-called Caspian monster. Now it's something between scrap metal and a monument on an air cushion. Well, all right, all that was a long time ago. But what about now? The Russian Ministry of Defense and even the Ministry of Emergency Situations, despite the need to supply power to remote facilities, they are not interested in such generators. The red-haired character has been moved from Rosnano to an honorary retirement role. Although, to be fair, he should actually be using hand tools to work in the hard-to-reach areas of the far north. Meanwhile, several companies around the world are already working on small atomic thermal power plants. For example, the company already has a project called 4 Super Reliable in Small and Simple, a super reliable marker, small and simple. The project closely resembles the Soviet aquifer thermal energy storage Yelena, whose demo prototype has been successfully operating for 12 years at the Institute of Atomic Energy. The company claims the cost of the electricity produced is 5 cents per kilowatt hour. This also includes the costs for decommissioning after 30 years and, of course, the profit from the sale. Here's another example from almost half a century ago. What do you know about the world-famous company that hid a small reactor in its basement for 30 years? The well-known company Kodak, a manufacturer of photographic equipment, admitted that since 1974 it had owned a small nuclear reactor. Only a few people knew about the installation. The reactor was located in the basement of Kodak's headquarters in Rochester, New York. The company itself claims that for more than 30 years, the nuclear installation did not pose the slightest danger to those around it. Nevertheless, the reactor operated on almost 1.5 kilograms of uranium, enriched to 93%. That's already a level quite sufficient for use in an atomic bomb. A nuclear reactor the size of a regular refrigerator was located in a basement with concrete walls 60 centimeters thick and was operated remotely. Neither the city authorities nor the state authorities knew about its existence. The thing is, private companies aren't allowed to have such reactors at all, or work with active radioactive material. However, it turned out that in the 70s, the United States government approved the release of such reactors for large companies. And 2 reactors were produced under this program. One of them was sent to the United States Department of Energy, and the other was purchased by the company Kodak. It turns out that a truly home-sized nuclear reactor was already created quite a long time ago, and apparently it worked steadily for all 30 years. But such stations can't really be called portable, though they can definitely be considered mobile. Miniature units the size of a standard shipping container can supply 10 megawatts for 10 years without refueling. The reactors are fully autonomous and safe, require no maintenance, and after their service life ends, they are simply recharged for another 10 years. The reactors can be used both for power generation and for heating. Such a station can power an entire village or a small town. The closest in terms of operating principle are the most common reactors that were installed at Russian nuclear power plants. Uranium nitride is used as fuel, which has higher thermal conductivity. It's simple here. The higher the reactor temperature, the higher the steam temperature, and as a result, the higher the performance of the steam turbine that generates energy. The unit with fuel and cooling system has a mass of 20 tons and is designed for 10 years without operation. The entire system is truck transportable before refueling. Upon arrival at the site, the barrel with the reactor is simply buried. Access to it is closed, and no maintenance is expected at all. After the warranty period expires, the barrel is dug up and sent back to the manufacturer for refueling. According to the designers, the design features make these reactors safe. Overheating and explosions are impossible because the pressure does not increase as the temperature rises. The developers of the technology assure that this reactor will never reach a supercritical mode. And if someone intentionally damages the shell, the active material will cool down quickly, and the reactor itself will turn into an iron block isolated by a thick layer of lead. Here's another example of atomic engineering thought. Everyone knows about nuclear icebreakers and submarines. But how about putting a nuclear reactor into a car? In 1957, the company introduced a concept car that became the most famous atomic automobile. It became the first development of its kind, as well as one of only 2 such cars ever created, even as a mock-up and shown at an auto show. The car was designed down to the last detail, taking into account the need for maintenance on public roads and the risk of radiation exposure to passengers. All that was left was to create the atomic engine itself. The nuclear unit, which took up 2/3 of the car's volume and weight, was a scaled-down copy of the standard reactor from an American nuclear submarine. However, it was very difficult to shrink a 35-ton, 6-meter-tall giant down to the size of a car. The limited space needed to fit the reactor, a steam generator, and 2 turbines, one to turn the wheels and the other to drive the electric generator. In principle, the idea seemed workable. The main advantage was the incredible durability of the power unit. Of course, refueling new rods into the old reactor was problematic, so the car could only be refueled by replacing the reactor itself. But one refueling was supposed to last for 30,000 kilometers. It was planned to refuel used reactors in factory conditions. This is like how gas cylinder charging and exchange stations operate today. However, time passed, but the compact reactor still didn't appear, and the company itself didn't have enough capacity to develop its own nuclear engine. The leading American manufacturer of submarine reactors was also in no hurry to change the design of its reactors, and the ambitious project was shut down before it even really got started. But that's not all. 5 years later, it was continued. In 1961, the United Nations adopted the famous declaration banning the use of nuclear and thermonuclear weapons. Accordingly, a huge number of laboratories working in this field had to suspend their research. The effort needed to be urgently redirected toward peaceful purposes. The company's marketers noticed a certain signal in this and immediately sent a task to the engineers to continue the Nucleon project. That's how it appeared. 21. This time, the developers tried not to repeat the mistakes made during the construction of the previous model. In particular, they kept the traditional car layout: engine, then cabin, then a trunk of normal size. Of course, the car turned out huge, but that was in the spirit of Americans in the 60s and did not violate the average person's idea of a good car. But since a compact atomic engine still didn't exist in 1962, they had to cram as many fantastic ideas as possible into the concept, which at that time were simply impossible. These ideas really drew a lot of attention to the company itself, because the know-how that the engineers presented was half a century ahead of its time. For example, this concept car didn't have a steering wheel as such. It was proposed to control the car by touching a special panel with your fingers. This is the prototype of the modern touchscreen. There was also an onboard computer in the cabin, the interface of which somewhat resembled. And this was in the 60s, when they didn't even exist yet, and Bill Gates was only 7 years old at the time. The main purpose of the computer was to plot routes. This became the prototype of the Global Positioning System Navigator. Sensors installed throughout the body took into account the road situation, the proximity of other cars, and weather conditions. In fact, the engineers of that time predicted the appearance of parking sensors, rain sensors, and safety systems. The windows of the 21 had a variable degree of tinting depending on the amount of light coming from outside. The car turned out to be really cool, and at several auto shows it caused quite a sensation. But the development of this car didn't go beyond the concept car stage due to technical barriers. Well, alright, that's in America. But what about here? In the Soviet Union? They didn't develop atomic cars, realizing that these were fantastic projects from the very beginning. But as for a mobile atomic power station, the length of several all-terrain vehicles, not only did they design it, but they even built it and put it into operation. This project was called Transportable Power Station, Triad, which stands for Transportable Power Station. The power unit itself was a compact two-loop reactor. Water was used as the working fluid, and the generator's turbine was driven by steam. The equipment was mounted on the chassis of a heavy T-10 tank and received the general name Energosamokod. The power plant set consisted of 4 energosamokods. The first housed the reactor itself with shielding and an air radiator. The second contained the steam generators and circulation pumps. The third had the turbo generator. The fourth held the control panel and backup equipment. Deploying the station took several hours. It could not operate while moving because all the energosamokods had to be connected with wires and pipelines. It was not difficult to provide shielding since the reactor that required isolation was located on a separate energosamokod. They simply placed it in a sealed lead container, and during operation, the operators did not approach this vehicle. The mobile nuclear power plant was ready for operation, and on October 13, 1961, the first experimental launch of the station took place. It performed quite well. The tests continued until 1965. But one problem arose. Neither industrialists nor scientists were able to find any practical use for this installation. It was originally designed to operate in the far north, but traditional liquid fuel installations turned out to be simpler and cheaper. Economic impracticality forced the project to be shut down in 1969. The thermal power plant, Triad, never used, was mothballed while work continued on the second mobile nuclear power plant, Pamir 630. Heavy MAZ equipment was used as the chassis. In many ways, this station was more successful than Thermal Power Plant 3, but unfortunately, its first trial launch took place in 1985, shortly before the Chernobyl tragedy. Thus, following the Chernobyl nuclear power plant accident, most nuclear work was halted. So, should we expect that very soon anyone will be able to install a nuclear generator in their basement? Or even haul a slightly larger generator based on atomic energy onto the roof of a regular apartment building, instead of a gas boiler room? After all, as you saw in this film, engineering thought is capable of a lot, and almost any idea can be implemented, including portable generators. But apparently, there are other factors that prevent such units from appearing in mass production. That's a good question, and it would be interesting to discuss it in the comments. Let me know with a like if you enjoyed this documentary, and if it's worth making something similar. On the topic of traditional nuclear energy, let me know if you'd be interested in watching a detailed episode about the big peaceful atom, about these giant nuclear power plants, their evolution, and their prospects. Thank you for watching, and see you on our channel.